We cannot know by reading Shakespeare and seeing him played whether he had any extra poetic beliefs or disbeliefs. G.K. Chesterton, a wonderful literary critic, insisted that Shakespeare was a Catholic dramatist and that Hamlet was more orthodox than skeptical. Both assertions seem to me quite unlikely, yet I do not know, and Chesterton did not know either. Christopher Marlowe had his ambiguities and Ben Jonson his ambivalences, but sometimes we can hazard surmises as to their personal stances. By reading Shakespeare, I can gather that he did not like lawyers, preferred drinking to eating, and evidently lusted after both genders. But I certainly do not have a clue as to whether he favored Protestantism or Catholicism or neither. And I do not know whether he believed or disbelieved in God or in resurrection. His politics, like his religion, evades me, but I think he was too wary to have any. He sensibly was afraid of mobs and of uprisings, yet he was afraid of authority also. He aspired after gentility, Rude having been an actor, and might seem to have valued the rape of Lucrece over King Lear, a judgment in which he remains outrageously unique, except perhaps for Tolstoy. Chesterton and Anthony Burgess both stressed Shakespeare's vitality. I would go a touch farther and call Shakespeare a vitalist, like his own Falstaff. Vitalism, which William Hazlitt called gusto, may be the ultimate clue to Shakespeare's preternatural ability to endow his personages with personalities and with utterly individuated styles of speaking. I scarcely can believe that Shakespeare preferred Prince Hal to Falstaff, as most scholars opine. Hal is a Machiavel. Falstaff, like Ben Jonson himself and like Shakespeare, is rammed with life. So, of course, are the great Shakespearean murderous villains Aaron the Moor, Richard III, Iago, Edmund, Macbeth. So indeed are the comic villains, Shylock, Malvolio, and Caliban. Exuberance, well nigh apocalyptic in its fervor, is as marked in Shakespeare as it is in Rabelais, Blake, and Joyce. The man Shakespeare, affable and shrewd, was no more Falstaff than he was Hamlet, and yet something in his readers and playgoers perpetually associates the dramatist with both figures. Only Cleopatra and the strongest of the villains, Iago, Edmund, Macbeth, hold on in our memories with the staying force of Falstaff's insouciance and Hamlet's intellectual intensity. In reading Shakespeare's plays, and to a certain extent in attending their performances, the merely sensible procedure is to immerse yourself in the text and its speakers and allow your understanding to move outward from what you read, hear, and see to whatever contexts suggest themselves as relevant. That was the procedure from the times of Dr. Johnson and David Garrick, of William Hazlitt and Edmund Kean, through the eras of A.C. Bradley and Henry Irving, of G. Wilson Knight and John Gielgud. Alas, sensible, even natural as this way was, it is now out of fashion and has been replaced by arbitrary and ideologically imposed contextualization, the staple of our bad time. In, quote, French Shakespeare, end of quote, as I shall go on calling it, the procedure is to begin with a political stance all your own, far out and away from Shakespeare's plays, and then to locate some marginal bit of English Renaissance social history that seems to sustain your stance. Social fragment in hand, you move in from outside upon the poor play and find some connection, however established, between your supposed social fact and Shakespeare's words. It would cheer me to be persuaded that I am parodying the operations of the professors and directors of what I call resentment, those critics who value theory over the literature itself. But I have given a plain account of the going thing, whether in the classroom or on the stage. Substituting the name of Shakespeare for that of Jesus, I am moved to cite William Blake. I am sure this Shakespeare will not do, either for Englishman or Jew. What is inadequate about French Shakespeare is hardly that it is not English Shakespeare, let alone Jewish, Christian, or Islamic Shakespeare. Most simply, it is just not Shakespeare, who does not fit very easily into Foucault's archives and whose energies were not primarily social. You can bring absolutely anything to Shakespeare and the plays will light it up. Far more than what you bring will illuminate the plays. Though professional resenters insist that the aesthetic stance in itself an ideology, I scarcely agree. And I bring nothing but the aesthetic, in Walter Pater's and Oscar Wilde's language, to Shakespeare in this book. Or rather, he brings it to me, since Shakespeare educated Pater, Wilde, and the rest of us in the aesthetic, which, as Pater observed, is an affair of perceptions and sensations. Shakespeare teaches us how and what to perceive, and he also instructs us how and what to sense and then to experience a sensation. Seeking as he did to enlarge us, not as citizens or as Christians, but as consciousnesses, Shakespeare outdid all his preceptors as an entertainer. Our resenters, who can be described without malice as gender and power freaks, are not much moved by the plays as entertainment. Though G.K. Chesterton liked to think that Shakespeare was a Catholic, at least in spirit, Chesterton was too good a critic to locate Shakespeare's universalism in Christianity. We might learn from that not to shape Shakespeare by our own cultural politics. Comparing Shakespeare with Dante, Chesterton emphasized Dante's spaciousness in dealing with Christian love and Christian liberty, whereas Shakespeare, quote, was a pagan insofar that he is at his greatest in describing great spirits in chains, end of quote. Those chains manifestly are not political. They return us to universalism, to Hamlet above all, greatest of all spirits, thinking his way to the truth of which he perishes. The ultimate use of Shakespeare is to let him teach you to think too well to whatever truth you can sustain without perishing. It is not an illusion that readers and playgoers find more vitality both in Shakespeare's words and in the characters who speak them than in any other author, perhaps in all other authors put together. Early modern English was shaped by Shakespeare. The Oxford English Dictionary is made in his image. Later modern human beings are still being shaped by Shakespeare. Not as Englishmen or as American women, but in modes increasingly post-national and post-gender. He has become the first universal author, replacing the Bible and the secularized consciousness. Attempts to historicize his ascendancy continue to founder upon the uniqueness of his eminence. For the cultural factors critics find relevant to Shakespeare are precisely as relevant to Thomas Dekker and to George Chapman. Newfangled expositions of Shakespeare do not persuade us because their implicit program involves diminishing the difference between Shakespeare and the likes of Chapman. What does not work pragmatically is any critical or theatrical fashion that attempts to assimilate Shakespeare to contexts, whether historical or here and now. Demystification is a weak technique to exercise upon the one writer who truly seems to have become himself only by representing other selves. I paraphrase Hazlitt upon Shakespeare as the subtitle of this book, Invention of the Human, indicates. I happily follow in Hazlitt's wake, seeking the Shakespearean difference, that which overcomes all demarcations between cultures or within cultures. What allowed Shakespeare to be the supreme magister ludi, Nietzsche, like Montaigne, a psychologist almost of Shakespeare's power, taught that pain is the authentic origin of human memory. Since Shakespeare is the most memorable of writers, there may be a valid sense in which the pain Shakespeare affords us is as significant as the pleasure. One need not be Dr. Johnson to dread reading or attending a performance of King Lear, particularly Act 5, where Cordelia is murdered and where Lear dies, holding her corpse in his arms. I myself dread Othello even more. Its painfulness exceeds all measure, provided that we, and the play's director, grant to Othello his massive dignity, and value that alone make his degradation so terrible. I cannot solve the puzzle of the representation of Shylock or even of Prince Hal, King Henry V. Primal ambivalence, popularized by Sigmund Freud, remains central to Shakespeare, and to a scandalous extent was Shakespeare's own invention. Memorable pain, or memory engendered through pain, ensues from an ambivalence both cognitive and affective, an ambivalence that we associate most readily with Hamlet, but that is prepared by Shylock. Perhaps Shylock began as a farcical villain. I once believed this, but now I rather doubt it. The play is Portia's, and not Shylock's. But Shylock is the first of Shakespeare's internalized hero-villains, as contrasted with such externalized forerunners as Aaron the Moor and Richard III. I take it that Prince Hal, Henry V, is the next abyss of inwardness after Shylock, and so another hero-villain, a pious and patriotic Machiavel. But the piety and the kingly quality are modifiers, while the hypocrisy is the substantive. Even so, the tenacious and justice-seeking Shylock essentially is a would-be slaughterer, and Shakespeare painfully persuades us that Portia, another delightful hypocrite, prevents an atrocity through her shrewdness. One would hope that the Merchant of Venice is painful even for Gentiles, though the hope may be illusory. What is not illusory is the frightening power of Shylock's will, his demand to have his bond. One surely can speak of the frightening power of Hal, Henry V's will, his demand to have his throne in France and absolute sway over everyone, including their hearts and minds. Hamlet's greatness is transcending of the hero-villain's role. has much to do with his rejection of the will, including the will to avenge, a project he evades by negation, in him of a revisionary mode that reduces every context to theater. Shakespeare's theatrical genius is less Iago than Hamlet. Iago is nothing if not critical, but he is at most a great criminal aesthete, and his insight fails him utterly in regard to Emilia, his own wife. Hamlet is much the freer artist whose insight cannot fail and who converts his mousetrap into theater of the world, where Shylock is an obsessive and Hal, Henry V, an ingrate who fails to see Falstaff's uniqueness. And even Iago never quite gets beyond a sense of the injured self, his own passed-over military virtue. Hamlet consciously takes on the burden of the theater's mystery as augmented by Shakespeare's strength. Hamlet, too, ceases to represent himself and becomes something other than a single self, something that is a universal figure and not a picnic of selves. Shakespeare became unique by representing other humans. Hamlet is the difference that Shakespeare achieved. I am not suggesting that Hamlet's beautiful disinterestedness in Act 5 ever was or became one of Shakespeare's personal qualities, but rather that Hamlet's final stance personifies Shakespeare's negative capability, as John Keats termed it. At the end, Hamlet is no longer a real personage condemned to suffer inside a play, and the wrong play at that. The personage and the play dissolve into each other until we have only the cognitive music of, quote, let be, end of quote, and, quote, let it be, end of quote. It is difficult to describe Shakespeare's modes of representation without resorting to oxymorons, since most of these modes are founded upon seeming contradictions. A naturalistic unreality suggests itself to meet Wittgenstein's annoyed comment that life is not like Shakespeare. Owen Barfield replied to Wittgenstein in advance, 1928. There is a very real sense, humiliating as it may seem, in which what we generally venture to call our feelings are really Shakespeare's meaning. Life itself has become a naturalistic unreality, partly because of Shakespeare's prevalence. To have invented our feelings is to have gone beyond psychologizing us. Shakespeare made us theatrical, even if we never attend a performance or read a play. After Hamlet literally has stopped the play to joke about the war of the theaters, to command the player king to enact the absurd scene in which Aeneas recounts Priam's slaughter, to admonish the players to a little discipline, we more than ever regard Hamlet as one of us, somehow dropped into a role in a play, and the wrong play at that. The prince alone is real. The others and all the action constitute theater. Can we conceive of ourselves without Shakespeare? By, quote, ourselves, I do not mean only actors, directors, teachers, critics, but also you and everyone you know. Our education in the English-speaking world, but in many other nations as well, has been Shakespearean. Even now, when our education has faltered and Shakespeare is battered and truncated by our fashionable ideologues, the ideologues themselves are caricatures of Shakespearean energies. Their supposed politics reflect the passion of his characters. And insofar as they themselves possess any social energies, their secret sense of the societal is oddly Shakespearean. I myself would prefer them to be Machiavels and resenters on the Marlovian model of Barabbas, Jew of Malta. But alas, their actual ideological paradigms are Iago and Edmund. Do Shakespeare's modes of representation in themselves betray any ideological turn? Whether Christian, skeptical, hermetic, or whatever, the question, difficult to frame, remains urgent in its implications. Is Shakespeare in his plays ultimately a celebrant of life beyond tragedy, or is he pragmatically nihilistic? Since I myself am a heretical transcendentalist, Gnostic in orientation, I would be happiest with a Shakespeare who seemed to hold on to at least a secular transcendence, a vision of the sublime. That seems not altogether true. The authentic Shakespearean litany chants variations upon the word nothing, and the uncanniness of nihilism haunts almost every play, even the great, relatively unmixed comedies. As a playwright, Shakespeare seems too wise to believe anything, and while he seems to know not less than everything, he is careful to keep that knowing several steps short of transcendence. Since his eloquence is comprehensive and his dramatic concern almost unfaltering, one cannot assign precedence even to the play's apparent nihilism. and to their clear sense of nature's indifference, alike to human codes and to human suffering. Still, the nihilism has a peculiar reverberation. We remember Leontes in The Winter's Tale hardly at all for his closing repentance. Quote, "Both your pardons, that ere I put between your holy looks, my ill suspicion," end of quote, but for his great paean of nothings. Is this nothing? Why then the world and all that's in it is nothing. The covering sky is nothing. Bohemia is nothing. My wife is nothing, nor nothing have these nothings, if this be nothing. His nihilizing madness matters to us, and his restored sanity does not, since true poetry indeed is of the devil's party, in William Blake's dialectical sense of the devil. Nahum Tate's sanitized King Lear, with its happy ending of Cordelia married to Edgar and Lear benignly beaming upon his daughter and his godson, cheered up Dr. Johnson, but deprives us of the kinoma, the sensible emptiness or wasteland in which the actual play by William Shakespeare concludes. Few among us are qualified to testify as to whether God is dead or alive or wandering somewhere in exile, the possibility I tend to favor. Some authors indeed are dead, but not William Shakespeare. As for dramatic characters, I never know how to take the assurances and remonstrances I receive from Shakespeare's current critics, who tell me that Falstaff, Hamlet, Rosalind, Cleopatra, and Iago are roles for actors and actresses, but not, quote, real people, end of quote. Impressed as I sometimes am by these admonitions, I struggle always with the palpable evidence that my chastisers not only are rather less interesting than Falstaff and Cleopatra, but also are less persuasively alive than Shakespearean figures, who are, to steal from Ben Jonson, quote, rammed with life, end of quote. When I was a child and saw Ralph Richardson play Falstaff, I was so profoundly affected that I could never see Richardson again on stage or on screen without identifying him with Falstaff, despite this actor's extraordinary and varied genius. The reality of Falstaff has never left me, and a half-century later was the starting point for this book. If a poor player struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more, we can say that a great player reverberates for a lifetime, most particularly if he acts not only a strong role, but a character deeper than life, a wit unmatched by anyone merely real whom we will ever know. We ought to get these matters the right way round. We are not here to make moral judgments concerning Falstaff. Shakespeare perspectivizes his dramas so that measure for measure we are judged even as we attempt to judge. If your Falstaff is a roistering coward, a wastrel confidence man, an uncourted gesture to Prince Hal, well, then we know something of you, but we know no more about Falstaff. If your Cleopatra is an aging whore, and her Antony a would-be Alexander in his dotage, then we know a touch more about you and rather less about them than we should. Hamlet's players hold the mirror up to nature, but Shakespeare's is a mirror within a mirror, and both are mirrors with many voices. Falstaff, Hamlet, Cleopatra, and the rest are not images of voice, as lyric poets can be. And they do not speak either for Shakespeare or for nature. In art virtually unlimited, Shakespearean representation offers us neither nature nor second nature, neither cosmos nor heterocosm. The art itself is nature, The Winter's Tale, is a wonderfully ambiguous declaration. If I am right in finding true Shakespearean character first in Falconbridge and The Bastard and King John, and last in The Tempest, that still sets aside superb plays with a very different sort of characterization, ranging from the perplexed triad of Troilus and Cressida, All's Well That Ends Well, and Measure for Measure onto the hieratic figures of the two noble kinsmen. That is to say, Shakespearean characterization is finally so varied that we cannot call any one mode of it true. Pragmatically, there is little difference between speaking of Hamlet as a character and Hamlet as a role for an actor. Yet mostly because of the peculiarities of modern criticism, the time has come around when it seems salutary to speak again of literary and dramatic character in order better to comprehend Shakespeare's men and women. Very little is gained by reminding us that Hamlet is made up of and by words that he is just a grouping of marks upon a page. Character means both a letter of the alphabet and also ethos, a person's habitual way of life. Literary and dramatic character is an imitation of human character, or so we once thought, on the premise that words were as much like people as they were like things. Words, of course, refer to other words, but their impact upon us emanates, as Martin Price says, from the empiric realm where we live and where we attribute values and meanings to our ideas of persons. Such attributions are a kind of fact, and so are our impressions that some literary and dramatic characters reinforce our ideas of persons, and some do not. There are two contradictory ways to account for Shakespeare's eminence. If, for you, literature is primarily language, then the primacy of Shakespeare is only a cultural phenomenon produced by socio-political urgencies. In this view, Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare. His plays were written by the social, political, and economic energies of his age. But so was everything else then and now, because certain more or less recent Parisian speculators have convinced many, if not most, academic critics that there are no authors anyway. The other way of exploring Shakespeare's continued supremacy is rather more empirical. He has been universally judged to be a more adequate representative of the universe of fact than anyone else before him or since. This judgment has been dominant since at least the mid-18th century. It has been staled by repetition, yet it remains merely true, banal as resentful theorists find it to be. We keep returning to Shakespeare because we need him. No one else gives us so much of the world most of us take to be fact. But in the book that follows, I will not just begin with the assumption that Shakespeare palpably was much the best writer we ever will know. Shakespeare's originality and the representation of character will be demonstrated throughout, as will the extent to which we all of use were, to a shocking degree, pragmatically reinvented by Shakespeare. Our ideas as to what makes the self authentically human owe more to Shakespeare than ought to be possible. But then he has become a scripture, not to be read as many of us read the Bible or the Quran or Joseph Smith's Doctrines and Covenants, but also not to be read as we read Cervantes or Dickens or Walt Whitman. The complete works of William Shakespeare could as soon be called the Book of Reality, fantastic as so much of Shakespeare deliberately intends to be. I've written elsewhere that Shakespeare is not only in himself the Western canon, he has become the universal canon, perhaps the only one that can survive the current debasement of our teaching institutions here and abroad. Every other great writer may fall away to be replaced by the anti-elitist swamp of cultural studies. Shakespeare will abide, even if he were to be expelled by the academics, in itself most unlikely. He extensively informs the language we speak. His principal characters have become our mythology, and he, rather than his involuntary follower Freud, is our psychologist. His persuasiveness has its unfortunate aspects. The Merchant of Venice may have been more of an incitement to anti-Semitism than the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, though less than the Gospel of John. We pay a price for what we gain from Shakespeare.